The palace was a place of polished stone, quiet corridors, and carefully controlled power. Within the courts connected to the household of Herod Antipas, life followed a rhythm shaped by authority, politics, and wealth. Servants moved silently through wide halls, carrying trays of food and wine. Guards stood watch near the gates. Officials came and went with messages about taxes, trade, and the endless negotiations required to keep a kingdom functioning under the vast shadow of Rome. To the outside world, it was a place of privilege, and within that world lived a woman named Joanna. Joanna was not an ordinary resident of the palace. She belonged to the inner circle of the court because of her husband, Chuza. As the steward of Herod's household, Chuza carried enormous responsibility. He oversaw the management of property, finances, and resources belonging to the ruler. Wealth passed through his records. Supplies moved under his authority. Servants answered to his instructions. It was a position that placed his family close to power. Because of that position, Joanna lived surrounded by comfort. Fine fabrics, secure walls, and servants ready to respond to every request were simply part of daily life. The palace offered protection from the hardships faced by ordinary people living across the towns and villages of the region. But comfort did not always bring peace. From the windows of the residence where she lived, Joanna could sometimes see beyond the palace grounds, past the outer courtyards and city walls, toward the hills that stretched across the land. Those hills held villages filled with farmers, fishermen, and families who lived far simpler lives. Their world looked very different from hers. Inside the palace, conversations often revolved around politics, alliances, and the delicate balance of power required to maintain favor with the Roman authorities. The ruler himself, Herod Antipas, governed the region carefully, knowing that his authority existed only because the Roman Empire allowed it. Every decision carried consequences. Court life required constant awareness: who held influence, who might become an enemy, which alliances should be strengthened and which should be avoided. The palace was not merely a home. It was a center of strategy and survival. Joanna had learned how to move within that world. She understood the formal greetings required when entering certain rooms. She knew when to remain silent during discussions between officials. She knew which servants carried news and which ones could be trusted with private conversations. Outwardly, her life appeared stable and secure, yet something inside her remained unsettled. Perhaps it was the contrast between the quiet luxury of palace life and the reality beyond its walls. Occasionally, travelers arrived with reports from distant towns, stories of poverty, sickness, and suffering that filled the land. Those stories lingered in her thoughts long after the conversations ended. She had seen enough of the political world to understand that power often solved problems only for those who already possessed it. The poor remained poor. The sick struggled to find help. The desperate had few places to turn. Inside the palace, those realities felt distant, but they were not invisible. At times, Joanna sensed that the walls protecting her life also separated her from something deeper, something more meaningful than the routines of court life. The festivals of the Jewish calendar still came and went each year. During those times, the city filled with travelers coming to worship, and prayers echoed through synagogues and homes. The ancient faith of Israel still shaped the identity of the people, even under Roman rule. Joanna had grown up hearing the stories of the God who had delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt, stories of prophets who had spoken with courage against corrupt kings, stories of promises that one day God would send a deliverer for his people. Those promises were part of the nation's memory, whispered through generations even as foreign empires ruled over the land. But within the political environment of Herod's court, such hopes were rarely discussed openly. Rulers did not welcome talk of coming deliverers. Prophets could easily be seen as threats. And the palace had already witnessed what happened to those who spoke too boldly. Not long before Joanna's story began to change, a powerful voice had echoed across the region, a preacher who called people to repentance and warned rulers about their corruption. His name was John the Baptist. Crowds had traveled long distances to hear him speak beside the Jordan River. His message was simple and fierce: turn back to God because judgment was coming. But that message had reached the ears of Herod, and John had openly criticized the ruler's personal life, condemning the marriage that had caused scandal within the royal family. In the dangerous world of palace politics, such criticism could not be tolerated for long. Eventually, John was arrested. Whispers about his imprisonment spread through the court. Some people dismissed him as another troublesome preacher. Others spoke more cautiously, sensing that something unusual had surrounded his ministry. Joanna heard those whispers like everyone else. The story of the imprisoned prophet lingered in her mind. A man who had spoken boldly about God had been silenced by political power. It was a reminder of how fragile truth could be in a world controlled by rulers and armies. Life in the palace continued as usual. Officials met to discuss taxes and security. Messengers arrived carrying news from neighboring territories. Servants prepared meals while musicians sometimes played during evening gatherings for the court. Yet beyond the palace walls, something new was beginning to move through the land. Another teacher had appeared. At first the reports were scattered and uncertain. Travelers mentioned a man who spoke in villages around the Sea of Galilee. Fishermen left their boats to follow him. Crowds gathered when he taught. Some claimed he healed the sick. At first those stories sounded like the usual rumors that often followed traveling teachers, but the stories kept growing. The man's name began appearing more often in conversations. Some people said he spoke about the kingdom of God with unusual authority. Others said that people suffering from illness had been restored after meeting him. His name was Jesus Christ. Within the palace, reactions to such stories were mixed. Some officials dismissed the reports entirely. Traveling teachers came and went all the time, and most of them faded quickly into obscurity. Others were more cautious. Crowds gathering around a preacher could sometimes lead to unrest, and unrest was the last thing a ruler under Roman authority wanted to encourage. Any movement that attracted large numbers of followers eventually caught the attention of political leaders. But for Joanna, the stories carried a different kind of curiosity. She wondered what kind of teacher could draw fishermen away from their livelihoods. She wondered why people would travel long distances simply to hear someone speak. Most of all, she wondered why so many people claimed their lives had changed after meeting him. The palace still surrounded her with comfort and security, yet the world outside its walls seemed to be shifting in ways no one fully understood. And soon, that shifting world would reach her life in a way she never expected. Because the woman who lived among the halls of power was about to face a moment that would change everything she believed about safety, purpose, and faith. The transformation would not begin with politics or power, it would begin with suffering. Life inside the palace continued with the same quiet order it had always known. Servants moved through the halls before sunrise, preparing the rooms for another day in the household of Herod Antipas. Officials gathered in chambers to discuss taxes, trade routes, and the endless calculations required to maintain political favor with Rome. Messengers came and went through the palace gates carrying reports from towns scattered across the land. To anyone looking from the outside, the world of the court seemed stable and secure. For Joanna, however, something had begun to change. At first the signs were small. A lingering weakness in the morning that refused to fade, a heaviness in her body that made ordinary tasks feel strangely exhausting. Some days she woke feeling as though the strength had been slowly drained from her overnight. She tried to ignore it. In a place where appearances mattered, admitting weakness was never easy. The palace valued composure and dignity, especially among those connected to positions of influence like her husband Chuza, so Joanna continued her routines. She attended gatherings in the courtyards. She spoke politely with guests arriving at the palace. She kept the calm expression expected from someone accustomed to life among rulers and officials. But the weakness did not disappear. Instead, it slowly deepened. Days that once felt effortless now required careful effort. Climbing stairways left her breathless. At times a dull ache settled into her body, spreading through her limbs in ways she could not explain. Eventually the signs became impossible to hide. Servants began noticing that she moved more slowly. Conversations had to pause when sudden waves of fatigue forced her to sit down. What had once seemed like a passing illness now looked more serious. Word reached the household physicians. Within the palace, doctors were accustomed to treating members of the royal court. They examined Joanna carefully, asking questions about the symptoms she felt, observing the signs they could see. They prescribed remedies common in the ancient world. Herbs were prepared and mixed into bitter drinks. Oils were rubbed into her skin. Rest was recommended along with various treatments believed to restore balance within the body. For a time, everyone hoped the remedies would work, but the illness remained. Days stretched into weeks, and the strength Joanna once possessed continued to fade. Some mornings she struggled even to leave her bed. The simple routines that once filled her life now felt distant and unreachable. Inside the palace, concern quietly spread. Chuza watched his wife's condition with growing worry. As the steward responsible for managing the resources of Herod's household, he was a man used to solving problems. When supplies ran short, he arranged more. When servants made mistakes, he corrected them. But illness was a different kind of problem. Even with the best physicians available, the answers remained uncertain. The doctors tried new treatments. Some suggested changes in diet. Others offered different mixtures of herbs and oils. Each method carried the hope that it might restore her health, yet none of them worked. For Joanna, the physical weakness was only part of the struggle. The quiet hours of illness created space for deeper questions. Lying awake in the stillness of her room, she found herself thinking about the life she had built inside the palace walls. The wealth, the comfort, the security. All of it had once seemed permanent. Now she realized how fragile it truly was. No amount of influence or privilege could guarantee health. No political connection could command the body to heal. The palace that had once felt like a place of safety suddenly seemed powerless against the quiet force of sickness. In those long hours of reflection, Joanna remembered the stories she had heard since childhood. Stories of the God of Israel. Stories of prophets who spoke about healing and restoration. Stories of moments when divine power touched ordinary lives in ways no physician could explain. Those stories had always felt distant, belonging to the past rather than the present. But illness has a way of changing how people see the world. Hope often grows strongest when human solutions begin to fail. As the weeks passed, visitors occasionally brought news from beyond the palace walls. Travelers arriving from distant towns shared stories about events unfolding across the region. One name appeared again and again in those conversations. The teacher people had begun talking about throughout Galilee, the man who spoke about the kingdom of God with unusual authority, the healer who, according to many witnesses, restored sight to the blind and strength to the crippled. His name was Jesus Christ. At first, the stories sounded almost unbelievable. People claimed that those suffering from disease had been cured after meeting him. Some said that spirits tormenting individuals had fled at his command. Others described crowds gathering wherever he traveled, hoping to hear his teachings or witness the miracles many believed followed him. Inside the political world of the palace, such reports were often treated with skepticism. Court officials tended to distrust movements that gathered large numbers of followers. History had shown that charismatic teachers could sometimes inspire unrest, and unrest was dangerous for rulers trying to maintain control. But Joanna listened differently. For someone trapped within the slow decline of illness, the stories carried a quiet spark of possibility. Could such things really be happening? Could a man walking through villages truly possess the power to restore what sickness had taken away? The questions lingered in her thoughts long after the travelers finished speaking. Eventually, the reports became too frequent to dismiss. Different visitors described the same events. People from separate towns repeated similar stories about healing and transformation. The name of the teacher spread across the region with surprising speed. Something unusual was happening in the land. And for Joanna, whose strength continued fading day by day, the growing whispers about this healer began to feel like a distant light in the darkness. She had lived among the halls of power her entire life. Now she found herself wondering whether true power might be found somewhere far beyond the palace walls. Soon, that question would lead her to a decision she never imagined making. A decision that would carry her away from the world of rulers and into the path of the teacher everyone was beginning to talk about. The decision did not happen in a single moment. For days, perhaps even weeks, the stories Joanna heard about the traveling teacher echoed quietly in her thoughts, while life in the palace continued around her with its usual rhythm of politics and responsibility. Her world had slowly narrowed to the confines of illness. The strength she once carried so easily had nearly disappeared. Servants moved carefully around her chambers, bringing water, preparing food she rarely finished, and adjusting curtains to soften the harsh light of afternoon sun. The physicians had tried every remedy they knew. Mixtures of herbs, oils rubbed into the skin, carefully prepared treatments passed down through generations of medical tradition. None of it had restored her. And yet the rumors continued. Travelers arriving from distant towns repeated the same astonishing reports about the teacher moving through the villages of Galilee. Some described blind men suddenly able to see. Others told stories of people crippled for years, rising to walk again. At the center of every story was the same name, Jesus Christ. Within the palace, many dismissed these reports as exaggerations. In the ancient world, stories often grew larger each time they were repeated. What began as a small event could become a miracle by the time it reached another city. But not everyone dismissed the stories so as. Among the servants and travelers who moved between towns, a different tone could sometimes be heard. These people spoke with a kind of quiet certainty, as though they had witnessed something real, something that could not be explained by rumor alone. Joanna listened carefully whenever such conversations reached her ears. In the stillness of her room, she found herself imagining the teacher these people described, a man walking dusty roads between villages, crowds gathering around him not because of wealth or political power, but because of the hope he seemed to bring wherever he went. It was a kind of power very different from the authority she had seen inside the palace. Eventually, curiosity gave way to something stronger. Hope. If even a fraction of the stories were true, then perhaps the healer people spoke about could do what the palace physicians could not. Perhaps somewhere beyond the guarded gates and stone walls of Herod's court, there existed a power capable of restoring what illness had taken from her. The thought felt both daring and fragile. Seeking help from a wandering teacher was not the sort of decision expected from someone connected to the court of Herod Antipas. Life in the palace followed careful social boundaries. People of status rarely left their protected world to chase rumors spreading through villages. Yet sickness has a way of changing priorities. When the body grows weak and the future becomes uncertain, the rules that once seemed important can suddenly feel far less significant. One morning, after another restless night of discomfort, Joanna made her choice. She would go. The journey itself was not simple. Traveling outside the palace required preparation and discretion. Word spread quickly when someone connected to the royal household appeared in public places, and Joanna did not want attention from curious officials or suspicious court observers. With the help of trusted servants, arrangements were quietly made. A small group would accompany her, moving without ceremony along the roads where travelers, merchants, and villagers already passed each day. The destination was not a palace or a marketplace. It was wherever the teacher might be found. The road beyond the palace walls felt strangely unfamiliar. For much of her life, Joanna had lived surrounded by stone corridors and carefully managed courtyards. Now the open landscape stretched before hairfields where farmers worked beneath the sun, villages where children played beside narrow paths, hills where shepherds watched over flocks. This was the world most people lived in, and somewhere within it walked the man people called a healer. The journey did not take long before they began hearing the sound of a crowd. Voices carried across the air ahead of them, conversations, laughter, and the rising murmur of people gathered around something that held their attention. When Joanna and her companions reached the edge of the gathering, they saw him. He did not look like the ruler she had known in the palace. There were no soldiers surrounding him, no rich garments marking his position, no banners or symbols of political authority. He stood among ordinary people, fishermen, mothers holding children, elderly men leaning on staffs, yet the crowd listened to him with deep focus. When he spoke, the noise of the gathering quieted. His voice carried calm authority, not loud or forceful, but clear enough that people leaned closer to hear every word. Joanna watched from the edge of the crowd. The teacher spoke about the kingdom of God as though it were something close, something unfolding even now among the people standing there. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that felt different from the speeches of political leaders. He spoke about mercy, about faith, about a God who saw the suffering of ordinary people. As Joanna listened, something stirred inside her. For a moment she forgot the pain in her body, forgotten the long weeks of illness that had slowly drained her strength. The words she heard felt alive, filled with a kind of truth she had never encountered within the political conversations of the palace. Then the moment came. Somewhere within the crowd, a man suffering from illness was brought forward. Those standing nearby stepped aside to make space. The teacher looked at the man with quiet compassion. He spoke only a few words. What happened next left the crowd in stunned silence. The man who had arrived weak and broken suddenly stood upright, strength returning to his body as though an invisible barrier had been lifted away. Shock spread through the gathering. Some people gasped, others stared in disbelief. Joanna felt her heart begin to race. The stories had been true. The power she had only heard about was real. And in that moment, standing among villagers and travelers far from the polished halls of the palace, Joanna realized that the healer she had come searching for was not merely a teacher. He carried something far greater, and somehow, she knew that her own life was about to change forever. The crowd slowly began to move again after the moment of healing. People who had watched in stunned silence now spoke in hushed voices, their eyes still fixed on the man standing calmly among them. Some whispered prayers. Others tried to explain what they had just witnessed, though the words always seemed too small for what had happened. At the center of it all stood Jesus Christ. He did not celebrate the miracle or draw attention to himself. Instead, he continued speaking to the people gathered around him, as though restoring broken lives was simply part of the work he had come to do. For Joanna, the moment felt overwhelming. She had come hoping to see something that might give her reason to believe the rumors she had heard were true. Instead, she had witnessed something undeniable. A man who moments earlier could barely stand now walked away with strength in his legs. The power was real. But watching someone else receive healing only deepened the question already burning inside her. Could it happen for her? Joanna stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, her body still weak from the illness that had drained her strength for so long. The journey alone had exhausted her. Every step she had taken along the road had required determination. Now she found herself wondering whether she had arrived too late. The crowd surrounding Jesus was large. People pressed closer, each hoping for a chance to speak with him or ask for help. Mothers held children forward, hoping the teacher might bless them. Men with visible injuries waited patiently for an opportunity to approach. Joanna hesitated. Her entire life had been shaped by the structured world of the palace. There were always proper introductions, formal greetings, and clearly defined roles determining who could approach whom. This place had none of those rules. Here, fishermen stood beside farmers. Travelers from distant towns waited next to villagers who had walked only a few miles. The crowd did not organize itself around wealth or status. Everyone was simply a person in need. For the first time in a long while, Joanna felt uncertain. Back in the household of Herod Antipas, she had known exactly where she belonged. As the wife of Chuza, she lived within the inner circle of the court. Servants greeted her with respect. Officials treated her with careful politeness. Here, none of that mattered. The people around her did not know her name. They did not care about her connection to the palace. To them, she was simply another face in the crowd. Strangely, the realization brought a quiet sense of freedom. For once, she did not have to carry the expectations attached to her position. She did not need to represent the dignity of the royal household or maintain the calm composure expected of someone connected to political power. She could simply be a person seeking help. Gathering her remaining strength, Joanna began moving through the crowd. It was not easy. The weakness that had settled into her body still lingered. Each step required effort, and the press of people made it difficult to move forward. But the closer she came to Jesus, the stronger her determination grew. She had seen what he could do. If there was even the smallest possibility that he could restore her, she could not turn back now. Eventually, the crowd shifted enough to create a small opening near where Jesus stood. Those closest to him were speaking quietly, asking questions or bringing their concerns before him. He listened with patience, responding with words that seemed to calm the fear and anxiety in their voices. When Joanna finally stepped forward, she felt the weight of every moment that had led her there. The illness, the failing treatments, the rumors of healing that had carried hope into her darkest days. All of it had brought her to this single moment. Jesus looked at her. There was nothing hurried or distracted in his gaze. His attention rested fully on her, as though the surrounding crowd had faded into the background. For a brief instant, Joanna felt exposed in a way she had never experienced before. It was as though the teacher standing before her could see beyond her physical illness, beyond the fine clothing that hinted at her life in the palace, into the deeper exhaustion that had settled into her spirit. She did not speak with the confidence she once possessed in the courts of power. Instead, her voice carried the quiet vulnerability of someone who had reached the end of her strength. She told him about the sickness, about the long months of weakness, about the physicians who had tried everything they knew without success. The words came slowly at first, but once they began flowing, it was difficult to stop. She spoke about the fear that had grown inside her as each treatment failed, about the realization that all the wealth and influence surrounding her life could not restore her health. Jesus listened without interruption. When she finished speaking, the crowd waited. Moments like this had become familiar to those who traveled with him. People had watched him healed many times before, yet each new encounter still carried a sense of wonder. Jesus stepped closer. His voice was gentle when he spoke. The words themselves were simple words about faith, about trust, about the power of God's mercy reaching into broken lives. Then he placed his hand upon her. For Joanna, the change came instantly. The weakness that had clung to her body for so long seemed to dissolve like mist in the morning sun. Strength returned to her limbs with a sudden clarity that felt almost impossible. The heaviness in her chest disappeared. The constant ache that had followed her through endless days was simply gone. She drew a breath, a full, steady breath she had not been able to take in months. The world around her sharpened into focus as the realization settled over her. She was healed. The same power that had restored the man she had watched earlier had now touched her life as well. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. For months she had lived in a slow descent toward despair. Now, in a single moment, everything had changed. Yet the greatest transformation was not only in her body. Standing there before the teacher, Joanna sensed that something deeper had been awakened inside her, a recognition that the man who had just restored her health carried an authority far beyond anything she had known in the Palace of Kings. And she knew, with surprising certainty, that walking away from him would no longer be possible. For several moments after the healing, Joanna could only stand in silence. The crowd continued to move around her, people stepping forward with their own questions and hopes. Yet the world felt strangely still. The strength she had lost for so many months had returned so suddenly that her body almost felt unfamiliar. Her breathing was steady. The dull ache that once followed every movement had vanished. She lifted her hand slowly, almost cautiously, as though testing whether the change was real. It was. The weakness was gone. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they came from relief rather than pain. The long season of illness had ended in a moment she could never have predicted. Before her stood the man responsible for it all. Jesus Christ had already turned his attention to another person in the crowd, speaking gently to a father who had brought his child forward for blessing. There was nothing dramatic about the way he moved from one person to the next. He did not demand praise or recognition. He simply continued helping those who came to him. For Joanna, however, the moment carried enormous weight. Everything she had known before this day suddenly felt distant. The months of suffering, the frustration of treatments that failed, the quiet despair that had slowly crept into her thoughts, all of it now belonged to the past. And yet another realization was beginning to grow inside her. Healing was only the beginning. The power she had just experienced had not come from medicine or wealth or influence. It had come from a man who walked dusty roads between villages, surrounded by fishermen, travelers, and ordinary families. The contrast with her life in the court of Herod Antipas could not have been greater. Inside the palace, power was displayed through authority and control. Decisions were enforced with soldiers. Influence was measured by the number of servants who obeyed a command. Here, power looked completely different. Jesus carried no weapon. He commanded no army. Yet people followed him because something about his presence stirred hope in places where hope had nearly disappeared. Joanna watched him for a long moment. Around him stood men who had clearly left their former lives behind. Several looked like fishermen, their clothing still marked by the work they once did near the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Others appeared to be travelers who had simply decided not to leave after hearing him speak. These were his companions. Not nobles, not officials. Just people whose lives had changed after meeting him. For the first time since her healing, Joanna felt the weight of the choice now standing before her. She could return to the palace. Life there would continue as it always had. The halls of polished stone would welcome her back. Servants would greet her with relief after hearing news of her recovery. Her husband Chuza would no doubt be grateful that the illness threatening her life had suddenly disappeared. Everything could return to normal. Yet something inside her resisted that idea. The life she had known before this day now felt strangely incomplete. For months she had been forced to confront how fragile wealth and security truly were. All the influence of the palace had failed to restore her health. And yet this man, this teacher walking the roads of Galilee, had changed everything with a single moment of compassion. Walking away from him now felt impossible. Joanna realized that if she returned to the palace as though nothing had happened, she would spend the rest of her life remembering the moment when she had encountered something far greater than the world she came from. The teacher who spoke about the kingdom of God, the healer who restored broken bodies, the man who treated fishermen and nobles with the same quiet dignity. The thought began forming slowly but clearly in her mind. Perhaps the purpose of her healing was not simply to restore her old life. Perhaps it was meant to lead her into something new. Later that day, as the crowd slowly began to thin and Jesus prepared to continue his journey toward the next village, Joanna found herself standing near several women who appeared to be traveling with him. Among them was a woman whose reputation had spread widely through the region, Mary Magdalene. People spoke about her story with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She had once lived under deep spiritual torment, yet after encountering Jesus, her life had been completely transformed. Beside her stood another woman named Susanna, who had also chosen to support the teacher's work. These women were not merely observers. They traveled with Jesus and the group of disciples, helping provide the practical support necessary for their journey. Food, supplies, and financial resources were required for a group moving constantly between towns. Joanna listened as they spoke quietly about the places they had visited and the people whose lives had changed after hearing Jesus teach. Something about their conversation felt natural, almost peaceful. They were not bound by the rigid expectations that shaped life in the palace. They simply followed the path that had opened before them. For Joanna, the decision that had once seemed impossible was becoming clearer with every passing moment. Returning to the palace meant returning to comfort, but following Jesus meant stepping into a life shaped by purpose. The choice would not be simple. Leaving the security of Herod's court would raise questions. It might even create tension with the political world her husband served. Few people connected to the royal household would understand why someone would voluntarily leave such privilege behind. Yet Joanna could not ignore the truth she had experienced. The man she had met that day was not simply another traveling teacher. He carried the power of God, and somewhere deep within her heart she knew that the path ahead, the path that would truly change her life, began by walking away from the palace walls she had always known. The road stretched ahead beneath the open sky as the small group of travelers continued moving from village to village. For Joanna, the world felt completely different now. Only a short time earlier she had lived within the structured security of the palace connected to the court of Herod Antipas. Every day had followed familiar routines, meals prepared by servants, conversations shaped by politics, and decisions made behind guarded walls. Now she walked dusty roads beside fishermen, travelers, and women whose lives had also been changed by the teacher they followed. At the center of the group was Jesus Christ. Wherever he went, crowds appeared. Sometimes they gathered slowly as word spread through a village that he had arrived. Other times they were already waiting when the group approached. People standing along the roads hoping for a chance to hear him speak or ask for help. For Joanna, every day felt like stepping deeper into a world she had never known before. She began to see the land not as a distant landscape beyond palace walls, but as the home of ordinary people living lives filled with struggle and hope. Farmers working beneath the sun paused to listen when Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God. Fishermen resting beside their nets leaned forward to catch every word. The teacher's message seemed to reach people in ways political speeches never could. He spoke about mercy, about forgiveness, about a God who noticed even the smallest acts of faith. Joanna listened carefully each time he taught. The stories he used, simple parables about seeds, vineyards, and lost coins, carried deeper meaning that slowly unfolded in the minds of those who heard them. The more she listened, the more she realized that his message was not only about healing bodies, it was about transforming hearts. And yet the miracles continued. One afternoon the group entered a small village where the streets quickly filled with people desperate for help. News had spread ahead of them that Jesus was coming, and families gathered with relatives suffering from every kind of illness. Some were blind, some could barely walk, others carried children burning with fever. Joanna stood nearby with several of the other women who traveled with the group, including Mary Magdalene and Susanna. They helped organize the crowd, guiding people forward so that everyone would have a chance to be seen. Again and again Joanna witnessed the same extraordinary pattern. Jesus would speak gently to someone suffering before him. Sometimes he touched them, other times he simply spoke a few quiet words, and suddenly the impossible would happen. The blind opened their eyes. The weak stood upright. The desperate found hope. At first, Joanna watched these moments with amazement, but over time something deeper began to form inside her. Each miracle reminded her of the day her own illness had vanished under the teacher's touch. She had once been the one standing in the crowd, uncertain whether healing was even possible. Now she helped others reach the same moment of transformation. Yet the life of traveling with Jesus was not always easy. Days often began before sunrise as the group prepared to move toward the next town. Roads were long and sometimes difficult, stretching across rocky hills and dry valleys. Nights were spent in simple homes offered by generous families or occasionally beneath the open sky. For someone who had grown up surrounded by palace comfort, the change was enormous. But strangely, Joanna never regretted it. The simplicity of the journey carried a sense of freedom she had never experienced inside the royal court. There were no political intrigues to navigate, no hidden tensions between rival officials. The group was united by a single purpose: to follow the teacher and support the work he was doing. And Joanna had something valuable to contribute. Because of her background and resources, she possessed financial means many of the others did not. Along with the other women, she began helping provide the practical support necessary for the group to continue traveling. Food had to be purchased, supplies had to be arranged, places to rest had to be found in unfamiliar towns. The gospel writers would later remember that several women, including Joanna, used their own resources to support Jesus and his disciples. It was quiet work, often unnoticed by the crowds who focused only on the miracles and teachings. But it was essential. Without such support, the mission would have been far more difficult. Through this work, Joanna discovered something unexpected: purpose. For years she had lived surrounded by wealth without truly understanding how it could be used for something meaningful. Now the same resources that once supported palace life were helping sustain a movement spreading hope across the land. Yet as the months passed, Joanna also began noticing another change. Not everyone welcomed the teacher's message. In some towns, religious leaders watched from a distance with suspicious expressions. They whispered among themselves when crowds gathered around Jesus. Some questioned his authority. Others criticized the way he spoke about traditions they believed must never be challenged. The tension slowly grew. Joanna saw it in the careful looks exchanged between certain men standing at the edges of gatherings. She heard it in the sharp tone of questions directed toward Jesus during public discussions. The teacher always responded calmly, but the hostility behind those questions was impossible to ignore. For Joanna, the contrast between the love shown by ordinary people and the suspicion from powerful leaders felt strangely familiar. She had seen similar dynamics in the palace where influence often shaped how truth was received, and deep inside she sensed that the path they were walking might not remain peaceful forever. The man who brought healing and hope to so many people was also beginning to challenge systems of power that did not welcome change, and history had already shown what rulers sometimes did to voices that threatened their control. Still, Joanna continued walking beside the teacher. She had left the palace behind, and the road ahead, though uncertain, was the only place she now wanted to be. The tension had been building for months, though many in the crowds did not yet recognize it. Wherever Jesus Christ traveled, hope followed him. Villagers welcomed him with excitement. Families brought their sick relatives. Children ran ahead of their parents just to see the teacher everyone was talking about. But not everyone felt joy when he arrived. Among certain leaders, something darker had begun to grow. For Joanna, the signs were subtle at first. During gatherings, she occasionally noticed men standing together at the edges of the crowd, watching carefully while Jesus spoke. Their expressions were not curious like the others. They were calculating. These men belonged to the powerful religious groups that held authority within Jewish society. Teachers of the law and respected leaders from the synagogues had long guided the spiritual life of the people. Their influence shaped traditions that had been followed for generations. Now a new teacher had appeared, one who spoke with authority that did not come from their schools, and the crowds listened to him. This created a problem they could not ignore. At times these leaders approached Jesus publicly, asking questions meant to challenge him. Their words sounded respectful, but their tone carried hidden traps. They hoped he might say something that could be used against him. Joanna watched these exchanges carefully. Jesus always answered calmly. When asked complicated questions about the law, he responded with wisdom that often left his challengers silent. Instead of speaking in ways that protected his own position, he spoke about the deeper meaning of the commandments about mercy, humility, and genuine devotion to God. The crowds often responded with amazement, but the leaders grew more frustrated. For Joanna, the tension felt strangely familiar. Years earlier, she had watched similar struggles unfold within the palace of Herod Antipas. Power rarely welcomed voices that exposed corruption or challenged authority. In political courts, truth could quickly become dangerous. Now she realized the same pattern was appearing again. Jesus did not speak like someone seeking approval from powerful leaders. Instead, he spoke as though truth itself carried greater authority than any human institution. One afternoon, while the group rested outside a village, several of the women traveling with Jesus spoke quietly about the growing opposition. Among them was Mary Magdalene, whose life had been transformed after meeting the teacher. They had all noticed the same thing. The crowds continued growing, but so did the hostility of certain leaders. Joanna listened carefully as they discussed the situation. Each of them had chosen to follow Jesus despite the risks that might come with such a decision. None of them fully understood where the journey would lead, but they trusted the one they followed. As the months passed, Jesus began speaking more openly about the difficulties ahead. His words sometimes carried a quiet gravity that unsettled those listening closely. He spoke about rejection, about suffering, about the possibility that his mission would not end in the triumph many people expected. Some listeners struggled to understand what he meant. Many believed the promised deliverer of Israel would overthrow political powers and restore national independence. They imagined armies defeated and kingdoms transformed. But Jesus described something very different. He spoke about sacrifice, about laying down one's life for others. For Joanna, those teachings carried an emotional weight she could not easily explain. The man who had healed her and brought hope to so many people was beginning to hint at a future filled with danger. Still, the journey continued. Eventually, the group began traveling toward the most important city in their nation, the place where the temple stood and where pilgrims gathered during major festivals. Jerusalem. The road leading there was crowded with travelers preparing for the upcoming celebration of Passover. Families journeyed together. singing ancient songs of faith while remembering the story of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. For many in the crowd, this journey felt filled with expectation. Jesus had performed miracles across the land. His teachings had inspired thousands. Some began whispering that perhaps the long-awaited moment in Israel's history was finally arriving. Perhaps this teacher was the one God had promised. Joanna heard those whispers as they traveled. She also sensed the growing unease among those who understood how threatening such expectations could appear to the authorities. Jerusalem was not merely a city of worship. It was a place where religion and politics collided. Roman soldiers watched the crowds carefully during festivals, ready to suppress any sign of rebellion. Religious leaders guarded their authority within the temple courts, and rulers like Herod Antipas monitored events closely from their own seats of power. For Joanna, returning to Jerusalem carried a strange mixture of emotions. The palace world she had left behind was not far away, somewhere within the networks of power that controlled the region. People still recognized her name and her connection to Chuza's household. But the woman walking beside Jesus now was no longer the same person who had once lived comfortably within those walls. She had witnessed too much, too many lives restored, too many broken people transformed by compassion. And now, as the city appeared on the horizon, Joanna sensed that the path they were walking was moving toward a moment that would change everything. The teacher who had healed the sick and lifted the forgotten was about to face the most powerful forces in the land, and the shadow of the cross was beginning to fall across the road ahead. The city was restless that morning. Within the walls of Jerusalem, the streets were already filled with travelers who had arrived for the Passover festival. Pilgrims moved through the crowded markets carrying supplies for the coming celebration. Priests prepared the temple courts for the rituals that would soon take place. Roman soldiers watched the crowds carefully from their posts along the city walls, but beneath the normal movement of the city, something else was spreading. Rumors. The man who had drawn crowds across Galilee had been arrested. For Joanna, the news felt like a sudden storm breaking over everything she had come to believe. Only days earlier she had watched as Jesus Christ entered the city surrounded by people who shouted praises and waved palm branches in celebration. Many had believed the long-awaited moment had finally arrived. Now everything had changed. The arrest had taken place during the night, quietly and away from the crowds. Religious leaders who had opposed Jesus for months had finally found their opportunity. With the help of the Roman authorities, they moved quickly before his supporters could react. By morning, the city buzzed with speculation. Some said he had been taken before the council of religious leaders. Others claimed Roman officials were now involved. The details shifted with each telling, but one thing remained clear. The teacher who had healed the sick and spoken about the kingdom of God was now a prisoner. Joanna stood among a small group of women who had followed Jesus throughout his ministry. Their faces carried the same mixture of confusion and grief. Among them were Mary Magdalene and others who had witnessed the same miracles, heard the same teachings, and believed the same hope. None of them fully understood how everything had unraveled so quickly. They had seen opposition growing among certain leaders, but the suddenness of the arrest still felt unreal. Soon the terrible truth began to emerge. Jesus had been sentenced to death. Roman execution was brutal and unmistakable. The condemned were forced to carry their own cross through the streets before being nailed to it outside the city walls. It was a punishment designed not only to end a life but to send a message to anyone who might challenge authority. The women followed from a distance as the procession moved through the city. Joanna could barely recognize the man she had once seen surrounded by hopeful crowds. The teacher who had spoken with calm authority now struggled beneath the weight of the wooden cross placed upon his shoulders. People lined the streets. Some wept openly, others watched in silence, afraid to speak. A few voices shouted insults, echoing the accusations that had led to this moment. For Joanna, each step along the road felt heavier than the last. She remembered the day she had first stood in the crowd watching Jesus heal the sick. She remembered the moment when his hand touched her and the illness that had stolen her strength disappeared forever. Now the one who had restored so many lives was being led toward death. The procession eventually left the city gates and moved toward a hill outside the walls. Crucifixion of Jesus would take place there. The sky seemed strangely dim as the execution began. Roman soldiers carried out their work with practiced efficiency, fastening the condemned men to wooden crosses that would stand as a warning to the world. Joanna stood among the small group who remained. Many of the larger crowds had disappeared by then, their excitement replaced by fear or disappointment. But those who truly loved Jesus could not bring themselves to leave. They watched as the hours passed. They heard the words he spoke even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, words of forgiveness, words of compassion, words directed toward those who had remained faithful beside him. For Joanna, the moment felt impossible to understand. How could the man who had healed the sick, restored the broken, and spoken about God's mercy now hang dying on a Roman cross? The sun slowly lowered in the sky as the terrible hours unfolded. Eventually, the moment came when Jesus breathed his last. Silence spread across the hill. Those who had followed him stood frozen, struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The teacher who had transformed their lives was gone. Later, as evening approached, his body was carefully taken down from the cross. With the coming Sabbath drawing near, there was little time for proper burial preparations. The body was placed in a nearby tomb. A large stone was rolled across the entrance. For Joanna and the other women, the grief felt overwhelming. The one they had believed to be the hope of Israel had been buried behind a sealed stone. Yet even in their sorrow, they made a quiet promise. After the Sabbath ended, they would return to the tomb. They would bring spices and oils to honor the man who had changed their lives forever. What they did not know was that the story they believed had ended in tragedy was about to take a turn that would astonish the entire world. The Sabbath passed slowly. For Joanna and the other women who had followed Jesus Christ, the hours felt heavy with grief. The city of Jerusalem had grown quiet after the chaos of the previous day, yet the silence brought little comfort. Everything they had believed about the future seemed to have collapsed. Only days earlier they had walked beside a teacher who healed the sick, spoke about the kingdom of God, and inspired hope in thousands of people across the land. Now his body lay sealed inside a tomb behind a massive stone. The world had returned to its normal rhythm, but their hearts had not. As soon as the Sabbath ended and the first light of morning approached, Joanna and several of the other women prepared to leave the house where they had been staying. They carried spices and oils carefully gathered the evening before. In their culture, such preparations were a final act of respect for someone who had died. Because the burial on the day of the crucifixion had been rushed, there had been no time to properly anoint the body. The women now intended to finish what had been left undone. The streets were nearly empty as they walked through the cool air of early dawn. Mary Magdalene walked beside Joanna, her face marked by the same quiet determination shared by the others. Together with them were women who had remained faithful even when many others had fled. None of them expected what they were about to see. Their only concern during the walk was practical. The tomb where Jesus had been placed was sealed by a heavy stone, rolled across the entrance to prevent animals or grave robbers from disturbing the body. As they approached the garden where the burial had taken place, one question repeated itself among them. Who would move the stone? It was far too heavy for them to shift alone. Yet as the tomb came into view, the women suddenly stopped. Something was wrong. The stone had already been moved. For a moment none of them spoke. The sight before them felt impossible. The entrance to the tomb stood open, the barrier that had sealed it only 2 days earlier now lying to the side. Fear mixed with confusion, Joanna stepped forward cautiously, her heart beating faster with every step. The early light of morning cast long shadows across the garden as the women approached the opening. Inside the tomb, the body was gone. The place where Jesus had been laid was empty. Panic began to rise among them. Their first thought was that someone must have taken the body during the night. Perhaps enemies had removed it to prevent the tomb from becoming a place of remembrance for his followers. But before they could fully understand what had happened, something else occurred. 2 figures suddenly appeared near them, their presence so unexpected that the women instinctively stepped back in fear. Their clothing shone with a brightness that seemed almost otherworldly. The women lowered their faces toward the ground, overwhelmed by the moment. Then the figures spoke. Their words cut through the confusion like light breaking through darkness. "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen." The message echoed through the quiet garden. Everything the women believed they understood about the situation suddenly shifted. The tomb was not empty because someone had stolen the body, it was empty because death itself had been defeated. The figures reminded them of the words Jesus had spoken earlier during his ministry. He had told his followers that he would suffer, that he would be killed, and that on the 3rd day he would rise again. In the grief of the past 2 days, those words had seemed impossible to imagine. Now they were standing inside the proof that they were true. For Joanna, the realization was overwhelming. The teacher who had healed her, the man she had chosen to follow after leaving the security of the palace, had done something no ruler or prophet in history had ever done. He had risen from the dead. The women quickly left the tomb and hurried back toward the city, their steps filled with urgency. They needed to tell the others what they had seen. When they found the disciples and shared the story, many struggled to believe them. The news sounded too extraordinary, too unbelievable. Yet Joanna knew what she had witnessed. The empty tomb, the shining messengers, the message that death had not been the end. Her life had already been transformed once when illness vanished under the touch of Jesus. Now she was witnessing something even greater, the beginning of a story that would spread far beyond the roads of Galilee and the walls of Jerusalem. The woman who had once lived quietly within the palace of Herod had become one of the first witnesses to the greatest moment in Christian history, the resurrection. And the story she carried would echo through generations, reminding the world that sometimes the most powerful testimonies come from those who choose to leave comfort behind and follow truth wherever it leads.